felt my body lock up. I didn't know if I should slam on the brakes, keep driving, or just jump out of the car and run. My breathing got shallow, like I couldn't pull enough air into my lungs. The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. And then he spoke. But it wasn't a normal voice. It was something deeper, more resonant, like it came from inside my head and not from the back seat. He said just one word: stop. My instincts were screaming at me to keep driving, but my body wouldn't listen. My foot felt glued to the pedal. The car started to slow down on its own. The speedometer dropped lower and lower until the car came to a complete stop in the middle of that dark, deserted road. Mark, or whatever that thing was, slowly opened the door and stepped out. When he did, a cold gust of wind rushed into the car, even colder than the air inside. It felt like that chill wasn't just the night air. It was coming from him. He stood there in the middle of the road, facing me, with that hollow emptiness where his face should be. I sat there paralyzed, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. No sound, no movement. 1 second he was there, and the next he had vanished into thin air. The only thing left was that unbearable cold and the overwhelming sense that something had just marked me forever. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, even though it was probably just a few minutes. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I spun the car around and headed straight back toward the city. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove, my hands shaking the entire time. Since that night, I've never taken another ride outside of LA. And sometimes, when I'm out late at night, driving through the quieter parts of the city, I still feel it. That same cold, that same heaviness in the air, like he could be out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And every time I pick up a passenger in the middle of the night, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping I'll never see that empty face again. Wearing a hoodie that covered most of his face. Nothing too strange for someone walking around late at night in LA. But there was something about him. I couldn't quite see his face, and the way he walked, kind of slow and heavy, like he was tired or, I don't know, something about it was just weird. He got in the car without saying a word. He glanced at me briefly, then settled into the back seat. I said something casual like, "Hey, how's it going?" but got no response. I figured maybe he was just tired or didn't want to talk, which happens a lot at this hour. So I put the destination into the GPS and started driving. The address was far, out toward the outskirts of the city, almost heading into the desert. I thought to myself, well, at least it's a good fare. As I drove, the silence in the car started to get to me. Mark, or whoever he was, wasn't making a single sound. No phone, no heavy breathing, nothing. It was like he wasn't even there. I looked into the rearview mirror a few times, and every time I tried to catch a glimpse of his face, it was like the light from the car wouldn't reach him. All I could see was the hoodie and a shadow where his face should be. I tried breaking the silence again. "Everything good back there, man?" Still no answer. He was just sitting there, staring straight ahead. By now I was starting to feel a little on edge. You know that creeping sensation when something doesn't feel right, but you can't quite put your finger on it? The road started getting more and more deserted. Hardly any cars passed us, and the street lights became less frequent. I could feel the air in the car growing heavier, like something was closing in on me, but I couldn't figure out what. About 20 minutes later, the GPS directed me onto a side road. It was a narrow, deserted road lined with trees on both sides, and barely any light. Mark was still there, quiet and still. My heart started to race. I tried to rationalize it. "Okay, Jake, it's just another weird ride. Maybe the guy's drunk, high, who knows? Don't freak out." But then something happened that made me question everything. The air inside the car suddenly turned freezing, like someone had cranked up the AC to full blast, but it was off. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and this time, he wasn't sitting normally. He was hunched forward, his head almost resting on the back of the front seat. It looked like he was mumbling something. I couldn't hear it clearly, but it sounded like he was praying or speaking in some language I didn't understand. At that moment, panic started to creep in. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. Calm down, Jake. It's just your imagination playing tricks, I told myself. But deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. Then suddenly, Mark lifted his head all at once. In the rearview mirror, I finally saw his face. Or rather, what should have been his face. What I saw froze me to my core. There was nothing there. Where his face should have been, there was just darkness, like a black hole. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. Just an empty void. I felt my body lock up. I didn't know if I should slam on the brakes, keep driving, or just jump out of the car and run. My breathing got shallow, like I couldn't pull enough air into my lungs. The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. And then he spoke. But it wasn't a normal voice. It was something deeper, more resonant, like it came from inside my head and not from the back seat. He said just one word: stop. My instincts were screaming at me to keep driving, but my body wouldn't listen. My foot felt glued to the pedal. The car started to slow down on its own. The speedometer dropped lower and lower until the car came to a complete stop in the middle of that dark, deserted road. Mark, or whatever that thing was, slowly opened the door and stepped out. When he did, a cold gust of wind rushed into the car, even colder than the air inside. It felt like that chill wasn't just the night air. It was coming from him. He stood there in the middle of the road, facing me, with that hollow emptiness where his face should be. I sat there paralyzed, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. No sound, no movement. 1 second he was there, and the next he had vanished into thin air. The only thing left was that unbearable cold and the overwhelming sense that something had just marked me forever. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, even though it was probably just a few minutes. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I spun the car around and headed straight back toward the city. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove, my hands shaking the entire time. Since that night, I've never taken another ride outside of LA. And sometimes, when I'm out late at night, driving through the quieter parts of the city, I still feel it. That same cold, that same heaviness in the air, like he could be out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And every time I pick up a passenger in the middle of the night, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping I'll never see that empty face again.
Story 2. The Encounter on the Deserted Street.
My name is Michael, and I live in Springfield, Illinois. I've been an Uber driver for about 2 years now. Besides driving around the city, I also do some side gigs as an IT technician, but driving is what I enjoy the most. I like the flexibility in my schedule and the chance to meet different people. Late nights have always been my favorite time to work. Less traffic, less chaos. Honestly, the city feels like a different place at night. Quieter, you know? But that night, something strange happened. It was a Wednesday, I think, and it was already past midnight. I had just dropped off a passenger in a more isolated part of town, near an older neighborhood. Since I hadn't received another ride request yet, I decided to drive slowly and take in the calm. It had been a long day. Aside from the rides, I'd spent the afternoon fixing a client's computer that, as usual, was loaded with viruses. I was exhausted, but still up for picking up a couple more rides before heading home. There are usually a lot of airport runs around that time, so I kept an eye on the app. As I waited, I found myself driving down a quiet, almost deserted street near some old apartment buildings. The area was peaceful, with few lights, and the trees lining the sidewalk made it even darker. But I knew this area well, so I wasn't worried. That's when I saw someone walking on the sidewalk up ahead. Normally, I wouldn't think much of someone walking late at night, but something about this person caught my attention. It was a woman. I could tell that much right away. She was wearing a dark, almost black dress and walking slowly, like she was a little lost. But what really gave me chills was the way she moved. Her steps were slow, like she had no reason to hurry. And the way she kept her head down, her hair covering her face, made my stomach turn. At first I figured she was just someone heading home from a party or maybe waiting for someone. But the closer I got, the stranger it felt. I can't explain it, but it was like the air around her got colder as I got near. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my exhaustion. After all, I'd been driving around the city all day, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I slowed down as I drove by her. I glanced over, more out of curiosity than anything else. It's not unusual for people to flag me down for a ride outside the app, but when I looked at her, my heart froze. She wasn't just walking with her head down. I couldn't see her face clearly, but what little I did see, something was off. Her face was pale, and her eyes, when she finally looked up and glanced at me for a second, seemed empty. Not sad or tired, just lifeless. That look hit me like a punch to the gut. I quickly averted my eyes and pressed down on the gas, eager to get away. You know that feeling when something is really wrong, but you don't want to believe it? That's exactly how I felt. I'd driven down that street many times, but I'd never seen anyone walking there, especially not a woman alone at that hour. I tried to shake the image from my mind and kept driving, but an almost instinctive urge made me glance in the rearview mirror. And man, she was gone. I swear I had just seen her, clear as day, walking on the sidewalk. But when I looked back, the street was empty. There was nowhere she could have gone. The houses had high fences, and there were no alleys or quick exits. It left me completely unsettled. I tried to come up with a logical explanation, thinking maybe she'd slipped into a gate I hadn't noticed, or maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I decided to loop back around the block. I don't know why, maybe to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. I turned onto the street again, my heart racing and my hands sweating on the steering wheel. All I could think was, I saw what I saw, right? I'm not crazy. When I came back onto the street, she was there, in the same spot, but this time she wasn't walking. She was facing me, standing still. The dim streetlight only lit up half of her body, and the rest faded into the darkness. But her eyes, God, those empty, fixed eyes pierced through the night. It felt like she was watching me, but not in a way that was human. More like she was studying me, waiting for something. A chill ran down my spine. I floored the gas without thinking twice. It didn't matter whether she was a person or something else. I wasn't sticking around to find out. The car sped down the street, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I finally turned the corner, I started to breathe again. But it wasn't a relief. That feeling of being watched lingered, like she was still there, lurking. I went straight home without taking any more rides that night. When I got home, I tossed my phone on the couch and headed straight to the bathroom. I washed my face trying to forget what had just happened, but I couldn't get her image out of my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty eyes following me. The next day, I mentioned it to a few fellow Uber drivers, but no one knew anything. It was like no one had ever seen or heard of a woman walking around there at night. But after that night, I never took rides or drove down that street again. I think we all try to find a rational explanation for things. Maybe she was just a regular woman, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me because I was tired. But deep down, I know something was very wrong that night. Something I'll never forget.
Story 3. The Final Ride.
You know when you start the day with a weird feeling, like something is about to go wrong? I'm not one to believe in signs, but on that Friday, the feeling was almost tangible. My name is Mark, and I'm an Uber driver in the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. I live in a quiet neighborhood called Willow Creek, where life is generally peaceful. Kids play outside, neighbors greet each other with a nod or a smile, and things run smoothly most of the time. My days are predictable. I pick up riders, hear their stories, some interesting, some not, and focus on making enough to pay the bills. But night shifts are a different story. There's something about the late hours that changes the atmosphere. Maybe it's the silence, or maybe it's the fact that the city feels like a different place after dark. I've always preferred driving at night, less traffic, fewer people rushing around. But on that particular night, I couldn't shake this growing sense of unease. I should have called it quits early, wrapped up the night before things got too weird. It was around 2 a.m. when I dropped off my last passenger. She was a young woman returning home from a night out with friends. We made small talk, weekend plans, the weather. But as soon as she stepped out of the car and I pulled away, that unsettling feeling hit me again. It was like a knot in my stomach that just wouldn't go away. I decided it was time to head home. I always take the same route back, a quiet stretch of road through the suburbs, where the street lights are few and far between. The night air was crisp, and the streets were mostly deserted. I turned on some music, hoping it would help me relax, but the tension only grew. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, someone darted in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. My heart jumped into my throat. The impact was undeniable, a heavy thud that reverberated through the car. I'd hit someone. I was sure of it. For a second, I sat frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced. "What have I done?" I whispered to myself. I felt the weight of panic settling in, my body shaking as I fumbled to unbuckle my seatbelt and rush out of the car. The night air felt colder than before as I stumbled toward the front of the car, my legs trembling with fear. My mind was filled with worst-case scenarios. I was expecting to see a body lying on the ground, blood pooling on the asphalt. But when I got there, nothing. No one. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. The street was empty. I glanced at the hood of my car, expecting to see some damage. A dent, a crack in the windshield, anything. But there wasn't a scratch. Everything was perfectly intact. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I stood there for a moment, utterly confused when I felt it. That unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned and there she was, a woman standing on the sidewalk, staring right at me. My heart nearly stopped. She wasn't moving, wasn't saying anything, just watching. Her eyes, cold and emotionless, locked onto mine. She didn't look hurt. No cuts, no bruises, no sign of injury at all. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice shaking as I took a cautious step toward her. She didn't respond, didn't blink. She just stood there, still as a statue, her gaze fixed on me like I was the one who had done something wrong. My stomach turned. Something wasn't right. The silence stretched on, the air between us thick with tension. I wanted to get back in the car, to drive away as fast as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at her, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions. Was she real? Was I losing it? After what felt like an eternity, she finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she turned away from me and started walking down the street. No hurry, no sign that she had been hit by a car just moments earlier. She just disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, my heart still pounding. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally snapped out of it. My hands were shaking as I got back into the car, my mind reeling. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her again, but the street was empty, silent. I didn't waste any time getting home after that, but even once I was there, the image of her face, the way she stared at me, was burned into my memory. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her cold, vacant eyes, the way she stood there, completely unaffected by what had just happened. I couldn't explain it, and the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. For days I tried to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, or maybe I was just too tired, but deep down I knew it wasn't something I could brush off that easily. Every time I passed that street on my way home, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and that feeling of being watched crept back in. A few days later, something happened that sent chills down my spine. I was checking the Uber app, going through my recent trips and ratings, when I saw a notification I didn't expect. It wasn't a name I recognized, just a single message. "I saw you." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. How could that be possible? I hadn't picked anyone up on that street. I hadn't even made a trip near there since that night. But there it was, staring back at me. The confirmation that something wasn't right. I haven't driven at night since.